Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, please do take your seats as we get underway with a really exciting panel. My name is Ben Jacobs from Seven League, and we've got a really special debate and conversation over the course of the next hour or so. We're going to be discussing outbound and inbound internationalization in sport. What that means in practical terms is when a US sports brand leaves America to a new region and some of the challenges they face, followed by when a non-US brand wants to come into the United States of America or any of the surrounding regions across North America. And once again, how do they succeed? We've got a great panel of insight for you. So please, ladies and gentlemen, do take your seats. And I'd like to introduce our first two guests who will join me to discuss, if you like, for the next 25 minutes, part one of this debate, which is the outbound aspect. Please welcome on stage David Hornby, the VP of Sport for Mailman Group, and Vivek Sethia, the founder and CEO of India on Track. So these are two gentlemen of huge esteem who have a lot of experience working with North American sports brands and those from all over the world when they wish to go to places they are perhaps less familiar with. David's experience with Mailman Group, one of the world's leading digital sports agencies, is in China and the APAC region, and as the name of his company suggests, India on Track focuses on India. David, let's start with you and talk a little bit about what Mailman Group do for any client really, but particularly those from North America that wish to leave familiar soil that they are comfortable with and try and expand to areas such as APAC and China. How can Mailman help them?
First of all, how many of you guys in the room have either done business in China or been to China? Just with a show of hands. Okay, so we'll start from scratch. China has an entirely unique and separate digital ecosystem to the rest of the world. So when you're investing into, if you're a sports brand, let's say a US sports brand, a football team, you're investing into content, video, social media, websites. The majority of what you are producing in the West does not penetrate the Chinese market. The firewall, they have their own social media ecosystem. You essentially have to start from scratch and create a strategy just for that one nation. So what do we do? Whether it's a team, a brand, a league, or an athlete, we help them build their business in China predominantly through digital media, so social media, commercial deals, trying to use branded content to sell sponsorship, and essentially create revenue channels out of the world's, or one of the world's biggest populations.
And Vivek, India on Track follows a similar mold. You help people with digital consultancy and do a range of agency work. What are some of the challenges a non-Indian, non-APAC brand unfamiliar with India may face if they choose to try and do business in that particular part of the world?
See, the biggest challenge that India faces is, even though some of the platforms are the same, we use the same digital platforms like Facebook and Instagram and so on, the challenge that India faces are the number of languages and the different nuances of the cultural nuances in different states in India. So you can think of India as 20 different countries. So for example, I'm from New Delhi, which is up north. And when I go down south, I don't speak their language. I don't have a similar culture. Our upbringings are different. And if it's not for English, we really can't even communicate at some point. So when there are 20 plus official languages, the challenge that international brands face is, what do we actually follow? So even though there is one official language, but regional languages are so common that fans cannot really connect with a particular language. So language becomes a challenge. And the other challenge is the demographics in terms of how people live, what they're connecting with, how they're connecting with different brands. So for us, the international brands coming in, localization is extremely important, and they can't look at India as one. India has to be divided into different sectors, and we always tell them that even if you don't want to attack India as a whole, just take smaller sections of India and then let's attack those.
So let's talk some practical things to both of you. In your regions, what sports work, and perhaps even which ones don't, and why?
So from a participation standpoint, the two biggest sports in China are ping pong and badminton by a country mile. But when you look at the consumption or viewership or broadcast, then it's basketball first, football second. There's not a huge crossover in terms of participation and viewership when it comes to football. Space is not readily available. You don't have these huge green parks where kids and families run out and play the game from the age of 2. So the culture of playing sports is very, very different. It's more trained, it's school and driven by either the state or a coaching mechanism that you have to pay for. So it's not so much that kind of Brazilian, or even when I grew up, you're outside kicking balls around with friends, brothers, whatever it might be. You don't have that same type of culture for football. When basketball is slightly different, there's courts everywhere, they're free to use. You go out on a playground, universities are just full of people playing basketball. So as far as participation concerns, basketball dominates football. What sports work? It's anything that has an authentic connection with that audience. So cricket, for example, does not work in China. They don't play cricket, I don't think they understand cricket, they don't watch cricket. Maybe in 50 years, if you do a phenomenal job of exporting the sport. Good luck with that. Rugby doesn't work. Kabaddi definitely doesn't work. But there's plenty of sports that do work. I mean, if you look at the rise of esports, sport or gaming, I mean, it's one of the most dominant markets in the world. So the way that Chinese jump on new technologies, new opportunities in gaming or at esports is phenomenal. It's faster than practically anywhere else in the world.
So from India perspective, we face a very unique challenge. The fact that both from a consumption perspective and also commercialization perspective, cricket is so big. So the first 10 sports are just cricket. And for any other sport to even penetrate a number 2 position or number 3 position is really difficult because cricket's everywhere. But from a participation perspective, both badminton and basketball are fairly big. There are courts everywhere in the schools, basketball courts especially. Football is becoming more and more professional, becoming more widespread, but it's again very regional. It's in 3 or 4 pockets of our country, and that's where most of football is. E-sport is definitely something which is coming up in a big way, and one of the main reasons for that is when gaming moved from a console-based model to a mobile-based platform, as it's evolving, that is the game changer in India. Because access to mobile phones and access to cheap data is tremendous. And like PUBG game, when that kind of came onto mobile, the whole scene has exploded. So those are the sports which work.
So a lot of the time you'll have, specifically in this context, a US organization, league, federation, or individual club wanting to come to China, and they may know that they've got a big audience there, they can see some of that data, they may even have a rights holder within the region, but one thing they perhaps won't understand is the digital culture. What kind of platforms do the audience consume content via, buy merchandise via, and so on? So maybe give us an overview as to the differences between a North American or Western digital market versus what you experience either in APAC, China, or India.
So the top 3, call it social networks in China, would be Weibo, WeChat, and Douyin, which is the TikTok equivalent. Within each of those 3 platforms, there are elements of what traditional Western platforms have. So Weibo has elements of Twitter and Facebook. WeChat is an entire ecosystem through which you run your life. You make payments, you buy stuff, you watch, consume content. Yes, it's a messenger app, so it has elements of WhatsApp, but it's so much more than that. And Douyin is consumption of short-form video content. Very, very easy to use. The algorithm feeds content based on preference. It's not really a pay-to-play model. It's one of the few platforms in China where you are organically rewarded for good content and viral content. Weibo is still a bit more pay-to-play. Most brands chase that vanity metric, so they chase the 4, 5, 6 million followers. Whether or not that is 4, 5, 6 million followers, it doesn't really matter to them because commercial teams can jump on it and sell it. So I'm seeing a slight shift from brands and organizations into what's the real metric to which you measure success or you measure popularity. And it's moving much more into either engagement model or media valuation. So if you were to package up all of your assets and sell it, what value would that have according to the local CPMs in the region?
So I'll give a good example of Major League Baseball. So an American brand wanting to enter India. Baseball's presence is almost zero. It's not a sport that Indians play or follow. Add to the fact that for most American sports, the TV timings are completely the opposite for India. So if you're a baseball fan, you have to wake up early in the morning to watch a game. So some of the things that they are doing is around leveraging cricket, for example. So in baseball, there's a bat and a ball. and there's a catching and throwing, which are all common assets to cricket. So I think leveraging some of the Indian assets, whether it's an Indian Bollywood celebrity or an Indian athlete. So La Liga has just signed a cricketer to promote the league, a cricketer who's organically loved and followed a couple of teams of La Liga, and that's been. So I think it's the hook, a very cultural hook, a nuance that you can actually leverage to be able to build across your content strategy is what kind of works in India.
Just hypothetically, with the influencer strategy, if US sports team, if Galaxy did reach out to a cricketer and said, can you help us promote our brand, how important is it that it needs to be authentic?
Oh, totally, absolutely. I mean, it's not the still water or a car, right? It has to be an authentic story. It has to make sense. It has to be. So we work with La Liga on the digital side, and one of the first things that when we were discussing an ambassador was we need a genuine La Liga fan, and it's a little difficult because Premier League's been in India for over 25 years, and La Liga is fairly new. So most of the celebrities are used to following the Uniteds and the Arsenals and the Chelseas. But it's really critical to have that authentic connection. Otherwise, it just falls flat completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a passion-based, passion-driven business, right? So if it's not connecting well, it just falls flat.
Being frank, should every sports organization that aspires growth necessarily try China, or is it almost a case of step by step? So if you don't have a monopoly within your North American market, and then you haven't succeeded making waves in more mainstream markets that appreciate the sport, which perhaps in football's case might be Europe first, then don't jump straight to China just because you assume there will be a commercial benefit, because actually you may do your brand more damage and end up, from a business perspective, falling flat on your face.
Yeah, I think that there's 2 points there. One, you don't have to be top of your game. You don't have to be the best team in the league, have the biggest stars. You just need to have a real connection or a story that you can use to jump into China. And I mean, you've seen in the last year, Espanyol's ratings and popularity since they signed Wu Lei has just shot through the roof. They wouldn't have and didn't launch in China until they had a real connection. And that's the moonshot. You have a Chinese player, and there's only one of them playing in major leagues in Europe. So it doesn't have to be a Chinese player. It could be a celebrity fan. It could be you have a legend like Zlatan who has a huge popularity in China from his previous clubs and what he's achieved in the past, and he brings with him a connection to Galaxy. And hopefully the next legend, the next superstar that comes to Galaxy will build that same bridge to a Chinese audience. But it's all about just having a real, authentic connection. And it can be small, but without that, yeah, there's no point in jumping headfirst into China.
I think on that point, for soccer in India, I think MLS has a much more significant opportunity, because for Indian players to be able to play in Europe is still extremely far-fetched. But to be able to potentially play in the US, where the level of difference is not tremendous, I think that's the opportunity. Second is Indians are obsessed with going and studying in the US. So a connection with universities, connection with scholarships, and so on. So I think there's opportunity for MLS teams or even MLS to, even if they don't dominate Europe, to be able to come to India and do a fantastic job.
And on that point, I have memories of somebody within the television world determining in a slightly gimmicky way that it would be beneficial to take the skill set of cricket, which essentially is hand-eye coordination, and find a batsman that could be turned into a baseball player. And then they brought them over, I think it might have been to the Kansas City Royals, and a couple of Indian players went over to North America and tried their hand at baseball. And it got a range of media. It went viral for a little bit. Are things like that beneficial because they fuse together two different cultures and they unite a sport in two different regions? Or is that the wrong approach?
Well, in that particular case, of course, it got a lot of PR to that property itself. But I think where it all faltered was these were adults. These were like 20-year-olds who actually had never played baseball in their lives. They could just pitch, throw the ball hard, and they were taken straight to MLB and into a trial system for being professional athletes. I think if you look at some of these cultural nuances which can be merged together, but at a youth level, and they can be a genuine opportunity for players to develop and evolve. I think that can work wonders. If this same project is done for 14-year-olds, and then we can take some of the good athletes and then train them in the US for a few years, and then hopefully they make it at the bigger leagues, that would probably connect a little better.
Of course, a brand is not just going to look at the opportunity, they're also going to want to have trust in each of your respected regions. How much clarity is there in APAC and China around all the things a brand would want to know? Audience size, TV ratings, ease of reaching sponsors and talking to the right people, health, safety, logistics. Are they clear regions to expand into, or is the whole point that you still need an intermediary like yourselves to sort of swim through the water and give you an accurate picture?
I mean, it's a bit of a minefield if you're trying to run an event, or in fact, if you're trying to do anything without local insight. So you either invest heavily in building your own team on the ground, which many clubs do. Gladbach have four or five guys sitting in Shanghai, they have a great office. But they also work with us, for example. So you don't need to follow one or the other. You can have your own representation team that focus on the commercial side of building the business, and then maybe you have some guys working for an agency that have done it for a very long time that are well equipped to produce content or run your video or grow your audience, and essentially work as a consultant and an execution team with you. It's very, very difficult to come in and sell tickets, run an event, handle the security guards. Like, there's so many loopholes and minefields if you don't have. I wouldn't even say that we're absolutely equipped there. We're not a ticketing or an event company, but it's so important to get that right, because there's been some horror stories of NHL in China having all of the equipment of both teams held at customs. So you had all the players up in Beijing and all the equipment down in Shenzhen, which is like a 3 or 4 hour flight. And that was just because one guy had a power trip and decided he was going to stop equipment being flown from Shenzhen to Beijing. And it's just having paperwork in order well in advance, and even then having a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, and hopefully one of them works. But it's a tough place to do business.
It reminds me of a time when in 2010, International Hockey Federation was hosting the World Cup in India, and maybe half an hour before the first game, the cop came and asked for 50 tickets. And this was an international CEO, Australian lady who had no idea about, and they were adamant that they'll run the show sitting from Europe. And she declined the tickets. And guess what? The lights were off 5 minutes before the match was supposed to start, the opening match of the World Cup. So, of course, they had to be given more tickets then. So, I mean, sometimes these things are extremely critical to understand how the local kind of politics and local arrangements work. And especially in India, and I'm sure in China as well, where there's just too many factors of interference. It helps to have an agency or have partners there that have local knowledge, can help out. And
it's cleaned up a lot since, like, for China, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that was very much the case, where call it bribery, call it whatever you want. Certain payments and certain gifts needed to be made. It's cleaned up a lot since those days. It's now a very professional industry. Since the Beijing 2008 Olympics, China just completely transformed in the way that it looked at sports as a business rather than a hobby or a pastime. So it's now you're very capable of not only building an audience, a real connection, developing fans, and making revenue, but it has to be a balance. In the same way in India, you can't just go into China looking to make money. You'll fall flat on your face. And you don't want to be taking from the country. You've got to be giving back and taking at the same time.
And I think that's a critical point, is if you look at especially the football clubs, most of the European clubs came to India started coming to India 7, 8, 10 years ago. And when I say coming to India, they were just visiting India and just meeting brands and trying to get deals. And barring 1 or 2 deals, really no club was successful. And then some of the clubs went back and started thinking of India as a long-term approach and strategy, and some of them have started investing in the country in terms of connecting with the consumers, with brands, with fans, and so on, building fans. And that's where digital becomes extremely critical. With such a big country, with so many different languages and cultures and so on, just to be able to leverage the digital platforms to create an outreach is the best way to approach India.
And there's a lot of different approaches. Like the NBA were first in China to really make their mark. They were smart. There's great stories of 25 years ago, the commissioner just sending the tapes of the playoffs physically to China the morning after the game and just going, please play me. So the NBA was the first organization to really start making some successful broadcast deals, initially for free, and then they had Yao Ming. And you can't plan or strategize around having a Yao Ming. It's a freak moment. It won't happen again. Or maybe it does, but it won't be the same.
Yeah.
So MLB have followed that model and have spent 10 years really investing into training centers, grassroots, to try and find the next Yao Ming, but they haven't yet succeeded there in the same way that they did in India. Yeah. So you can't, to your point earlier, just come in and cross sports and just try and pluck some talent out of nowhere and then train them up. Like, you've got to change the culture of football or basketball. And I mean, the Aussie rule AFL, they built a Guangzhou academy, put a bunch of kids through their paces, worked out which ones had the right attributes, and then tried to pluck them out and put them into the AFL. I mean, it's never going to work. It's impossible. If they haven't grown up watching or learning the game, they don't understand necessarily how to play it, even if you can jump high and catch a ball. So it's very tough you've got to start at the ground level, at grassroots, in order to really make a difference in the long term.
You mentioned the politics and the sensitivities, and maybe at times from US clubs and federations, a lack of understanding about how the culture works and how business is done. And most people will have seen the NBA story where one tweet effectively derailed an entire tour to China, and in doing so jeopardized the brand's longevity in that particular part of the world. Now, I appreciate there may not be that much of the ins and outs that you either wish to or will know about to go into in any great way, shape or form, although Mailman are affiliated to the NBA as are Seven League. But how do you prevent either that incident, or if you don't want to go specifically into that incident, an incident like that? Is it education? Is it having that direct relationship with the brand? Is it just coming there over and over and over again so you can make these mistakes and over time you learn the finesse of the region? Or was that just the kind of freak incident that is not preventable because it's one person clicking a button without thinking?
So there's been quite a few instances of PR crises, disasters, whatever you might want to call them. That was a big one. But I mean, Chelsea had Kennedy a couple of years back on a tour, post a stupid photo. Brooklyn Beckham got done. The NBA, just the latest in a long lineup. They all bounced back. And I think the main message would be, if you are trying to do business in that country in the same way as you would be in India, just think before you speak. Be slightly respectful towards something that might be considered sensitive in that market as opposed to in the US. I don't think it's a case of freedom of speech discussion, which has been made a big deal about in the US. It's just a case of, don't bring something to light, maybe don't comment on it unless you are either an expert or in that case a historian, that you know is going to cause an issue. But the NBA have already bounced back, they're back on the air. I think the NBA teams will look at this as an opportunity to maybe come out from under the NBA powerful umbrella and start to build their own relationships, their own commercial interests. In China, you're very much an NBA fan or a basketball fan. You're not first and foremost a Lakers fan. You will love Kobe, you'll love LeBron. It's a very different way in which the fans in the US support the league and the sport, whereas football is really driven by the teams. And the leagues then come second. And in the Premier League's case, they allow the teams to really build the brand, go out. They give them a lot of flexibility, freedom to make commercial deals in numerous categories. So how do you prevent PR? I mean, you can't at the end of the day. You just have to be sensitive to the local customs. So to your point, education is the only way of doing it, and that's educating the players all the way up to the CEO about what they should and shouldn't say or comment on when it comes to China, India, and countries where there is that political sensitivity.
So last year in India, Kevin Durant made a visit, and he was there for a few days doing various charitable kind of activities. And towards the end of the visit, he said something like, I would never come back, like the slums of India, it's dirty, or something to that effect, where he actually, it was taken a little out of context, but he didn't really mean that harm. Like he clarified and said, I have grown up from the slums. It's just like how I embrace my, community back home. This is how I meant it. But I think the education bit is critical, and sometimes you don't understand the small aspects of cultural aspects, and you kind of say something which doesn't make sense. So a lot of work on educating and a lot of work on being able to really make sure what's out there is well thought out is critical, and especially in India, where if it becomes in the wrong side of the political system, then everything goes down the drain.
Just a final question before we open it up to the floor. How in your regions do you strike a balance between giving things away in order to expand to the region versus selling things? How much ground should someone thinking about going into China from a club or a federation stand? So we have the La Liga example in India and across the whole of the Indian subcontinent, where they would give their rights to Facebook, very cheap deal, and it would air for free on Facebook. But then an established league going into China may say, do we need China desperately? And if we feel like we'll only take it if the right amount of revenue comes back, then they may stand their ground a little bit more. So what's your take on someone wanting to succeed in China as to what they should do, commercially speaking, with their actual product?
So it's always going to be a long-term play. You can't go into China or India and expect to have quick wins. It took the NBA 20, 25 years before they started making significant money. So the most important thing is to actually have your product or your content piece out there being viewed by an audience. For the majority of the time that sports has been broadcast on mainstream media in China, it's been for free. And about 5-6 years ago, there was a switch where a media company came in and paid the Premier League a fair amount of money and tried to put that content behind a paywall, and nobody watched it. And still today, 6 years on, 2 rights cycles on, it's very, very difficult to change that mindset that they are used to having premium sports content for free, and now you have to pay for it. So at some point, they will realize that it may not be the model. And at some point, the Chinese companies paying £400 million to the Premier League will realize they cannot monetize it. So you have to look to the brands, and this is either local brands or your own international brand sponsors, and say, like, how do you really make China a valuable part of the world through the vehicle, which is your IP? You can make money in China, it's just not easy and it's not quick. And I mean, Vivek's company invests a lot into grassroots, into training, because a lot of the money is parents spending on their kids looking for a brighter future. And if that future means playing football to get you into college in the UK or in the US, they will spend a lot of money on it. So there's so many untapped areas of revenue where a club might go in and open up a soccer school, but to me, like, what's the value in training 100 kids because someone's paid you to train 100 kids when it's a country of 1.4 billion and you're not really making a mark? So I think your grassroots model has to be scalable, and you will, in the long run, be able to make some serious progress and build a successful business.
I think it's fairly similar in India. You have to be able to give before it comes back. And there are lots of brands that tried the other model, and it just failed for almost all of them. A great example is the NBA in India. They came to India with the view that let's just invest in the country, not just by giving free content, but also do developmental projects. Because I think India is one step backwards from that perspective. It's just giving away free television content is not enough. You have to incentivize the people to even watch the free content. So what NBA did was run junior NBA programs, run free training, free camps, jam sessions, match screenings, and so on and so forth. La Liga is doing something similar, where they are investing heavily in the fans to be able to accept the product. So I think we are one step behind in terms of accepting the product itself, and then I think monetization will take a much longer time eventually. But the brands that have come and been able to monetize from the get-go have been far and few.
Great stuff. We've perhaps just got time for a quick question if anybody would like to stick their hand up before we move on to the second half of this panel. Has anybody got a question? Stick up your hand and say where you're from. If so, we will take one at the back here.
For the countries like India and China, will the huge population give a benefit for digital marketing? Because the huge consumption, huge population, is that an advantage or disadvantage? Because just like you just said, the different languages in India and different people in China, some people are well educated and some people are not so well educated. Will it make it easier for digital marketing or make it not so easy for digital marketing?
Well, it's a bit of both. It's a disadvantage in the sense that I hear so often there's 1.4 billion people in China. You know, if you just get 1% of that, then you'd be laughing. That's an unrealistic comment, and it's not a very well-educated comment. You can't look at it as 1.4 billion potential football fans. You've got to scale it right down. And as you say, look at the different country, the different regions, different levels of wealth and education. And you cannot treat it like one country, essentially, in the same way as India. I mean, it's an advantage in that you have scale with everything, and digital media makes that possible. You could not go door to door. You couldn't be in every city. It's impossible. So using social, using digital media is the only way to have a shot at reaching a much, much wider audience than when you can be very focused in a much smaller European country, for example. So it's a good and a bad thing.
So advantage, to answer your question, is for India is that it is definitely, digital is an advantage than a disadvantage for sure. Even though there are these different strategies that, from a content perspective, that need to be built, but there is really no other way to be able to approach the Indian market with so many different regions and such a large population otherwise. So for most brands, even if their budgets are low, at least with digital, they can start with 1 or 2 small pockets of India and just, start building affinity with the fan group.
And it does make it quite difficult when you're trying to keep expectations in check, because you have a brand and they look at the population size in China, so they expect all numbers to be enormous, which is, again, unrealistic. You can't treat it any differently to another country where you're launching a brand or you're brand new in that space. And you can't expect millions and millions of people to watch a video, like a comment, if your sport or your product or your brand is relatively new. So trying to educate or re-educate brands, organizations from the West that it's not going to be plain sailing. You may start with small numbers, and that will also stretch to the commercial teams. They're not going to be 20 brands knocking on their door to give them money. It's just not going to happen. So there's a big education piece that still needs to be done when approaching China and India.
Thank you for your question. We'll move on to the next panel in a moment, but I've got to say I'm very disappointed in everyone because the key question of the last half an hour has not been asked, and I was hoping someone would stick their hand up and pose this to Vivek, which is, where did you get your socks?
That's the Indian red, the red blood in me.
Wow, great stuff. Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, give a big round of applause to David Hornby from Mailman Group and Vivek Sethia.